Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at people of African descent, indirectly, because I'm looking at this for the last 10 years and going on to the next 10 years, they have this thing called the International Decade for the People of African Descent. This is a proclamation made by the United Nations in 2015. And they recently renewed it this year. So the UN General Assembly proclaimed in 2015 this 10-year International Decade for the People of African Descent, citing the need to strengthen national, regional, and international cooperation in relation to the full enjoyment of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights for people of African descent. So, that's coming from the United Nations website in relations to this so-called decade for people of African descent. Basically, they're saying they want to tackle issues about racism and underachievement and some of the marginalization of people of African descent around the world. So continuing, this international decade has some main objectives, and the three main objectives are to promote, respect, protect, and fulfillment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for people of African descent as recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, that document is also questionable in terms of its focus on individual rights. And second, promote a greater knowledge of and respect for the diverse heritage, culture, and contribution of people of African descent to the development of their societies, or to development of societies in general. And thirdly, adopt and strengthen national, regional, and international legal frameworks according to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racism, and to ensure their full effective implementation. Some of these ideas that they want to eliminate racism totally is not really, unless you eliminate white supremacy in the world, you'll never eliminate racism, particularly in the Western world. And the program of activities on two levels, you have the national level and then the international and regional levels. On the national level, states should take concrete and practical steps through the adoption and effective implementation of national and international legal frameworks, policies, and programs to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance faced by people of African descent, taking into account the particular situation of women, girls, and young males in the following areas that deal with recognition of justice, development, multiple aggravated discrimination. When you talk about xenophobia, for example, you have xenophobia in what they call xenophobia, even here on the continent in South Africa, but that is not based on race. It's based, some would say it's based on ethnicity, but it's also based on the fact that South Africa is a place where white racism and suppression of the people of South Africa is not recognized fully by fellow Africans coming into that region from other parts of the continent, who will look at their fellow Africans as somehow lazy and people who are not making effort to develop their society, not recognizing or acknowledging the oppression that they faced under the apartheid system would have affected their perception of the society that they're in, to the extent that you could argue that they don't want to contribute to this white society, even though they helped build that, their labor built the societies of South Africa. Maybe they're looking at the fact that they were invaded and they're stripped of their lands and they were forced to build somebody else's society. Even though they were building it, they couldn't fully partake in it. So now that this apartheid is over, there's still some feeling of not wanting to take part in that society because they don't really see it fully as their own. It's basically an imposed society. Even though people coming from other parts of the continent, maybe aspiring to that society because they see Western societies as something superior. The South Africans themselves may perceive it differently. So anyway, this is the regional aspects of this international decade. At the regional and international levels, the international community and international and regional organizations are called, among other things, to raise awareness, disseminate the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, assist states in the full and effective implementation of their commitments under this Durban Declaration in terms of collecting data and incorporating human rights into their development programs and so forth, and preserve the historical memory of people of African descent. You know, in many Western societies, particularly in Western societies, but you also found it in South America, there's an attitude towards people of African descent. This general attitude of seeing Africans as inferior. So even when they go to clinics, as I'll mention later on, they're not treated properly. And this perceptions that Africans have not contributed to history. So, because of that view of African people, but then again, even if somebody hasn't contributed to history, there's no need for you to have to say that you're going to treat them a particular way. So there's a definite bias and prejudice shown by people across the world, not only the Europeans, you find it in other nations as well. Partly because, yes, there's a lack of understanding of the true contributions of people of African descent in world history, but also their own prejudices of seeing a person of darker skin in a negative light for no particular reason. Anyway, continuing, this is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This part of the UN was selected to oversee this decade of International Decade for People of African Descent. So anyway, on the 17th of December 2024, the generals, this is in regard to the second International Decade which started this year. So basically they renewed the program. So it's saying that the General Assembly adopted the resolutions 79-193, which it proclaimed the second International Decade for the People of African Descent, with the theme People of African Descent, Recognition, Justice and Development. So it began on the 1st of January this year and ends on the 31st of December 2034. And going on to say, the General Assembly appointed the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to act as the coordinator for the decade and to follow up on the implementation of activities in the framework of the decade. So that's some of the basics behind this program, or what agenda or program, whatever you want to call it, in terms of dealing with the racism still relating to black people around the world. Whether it will make much difference, we'll see, but a number of countries are supposed to have made political changes to their policies regarding race. But as we know, countries may have those policies, but whether they actually fully implement them is a different story. Anyway, this idea, or this second decade, was acknowledged by CARICOM, and the chair is Professor Hilary Beckles, I should say, not Beckles. He says, I welcome the observance by the United Nations of a second International Decade for the People of African Descent for continued focus, attention to the advancement of African people. This is a great outcome resulting from the concerted activism of civil society and governments in the Americas and in Africa. That's what he had stated in terms of recognizing this UN program. Anyway, let's have a look at what this thing will tackle. You know, there have been reports and conferences that have observed the large numbers of African people amongst the groups of poorer or most marginalized people in the world, And this is intentional in the diaspora and on the continent in terms of wanting to subjugate black people so that the African black people don't become developed, rise up to a level that they can compete technologically and economically and militarily with the Western countries. The West fears what they perceive to be the wrong types of people becoming powerful in the world. That is the African or the black person. And if you look at what's happening in West Asia, also those Arabs or Muslims or whatever you want to define them are also perceived as those who the West doesn't want to rise up and become economically strong. Even though they may not threaten the West, the fact that they're equal in economic and military strength is perceived as a threat to the West. It means they can't dominate and do what they want in the world. But when the other regions of the world is weak, they can come in and manipulate them just for their resources, or basically just so that they can be in a position of dominance. So dominance is the main factor here, dominance and control. Because once you control the world militarily and politically, basically there's no threat to your, you could argue that a competing society in terms of concepts and ideas and perception of the world may bring down your own perception of the world, because they're coming with something which even your own people may perceive as better than what you have to offer. So your influence in the world can decline. But I think economics is one of the main factors, but I'll look at that later on. Anyway, let me continue with this. These marginalization of people, of African people or black people, this is a direct consequence of the slave trade and the enslavement of African and African descendant women, men and children over 4 centuries, and the colonization period. The dehumanization of these people was based on Occidental intellectual currents of thought of that period, which justified the practice of slavery through biased and false theories. Well, the false theories were created in order to justify the slavery and the subjugation of the people, because their own earlier Europeans had a different perception of African people. But because I think after, the period when Europe was invaded by the Moors, the Africans and the Moors, or the African Moors, they were almost subjected to the new knowledge that came from this invasion, this so-called invasion. And the knowledge that they gained and the science that they gained from this schooling, you could almost say, from the East and Africa, allowed them to push back and push out into the world, where they now ventured out and started colonizing other regions of the world. But to justify their push out into the world and their subjugation of other people, they had to give the impression that these people were somehow primitive and backward, so they had a right to go out and subjugate them. Anyway, this school of thought was at the core of the development of anti-black ideology legally enshrined in the Code Noir. This Code Noir, I don't know if I pronounce it right, was a document that was used in the Americas by the French to subjugate. There's a set of rules of how Africans were supposed to be treated, basically. And it's also mentioned Jews. They wanted the Jews out of the Caribbean, and they wanted Africans to be taught Catholic Christianity and to be treated in a particular manner. Racism, inherited from infamous practices of slavery and colonialism, persists today in the structural and interpersonal institutional discriminations faced by people. Sometimes people know better, but they still want to have this perception in their mind of African people. Let me give an example. Even the Chinese are seen to be advanced people, but they still face racism, even though many people know that in terms of science they're on par with or ahead of the Europeans, but there's still a prejudice against them. Anyway, let's look at this permanent, there's also this permanent forum for people of African descent, which was formed more recently than the first decade of for people of African descent. So the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent was established in 2021 by the General Assembly as a consultative and advisory body to the UN system and the Human Rights Council. It serves as a vital platform for improving safety, quality of life, and livelihoods of people of African descent worldwide. So its mandate includes providing expert advice on addressing racism, contributing to the draft UN Declaration on Rights of African People and people of African descent. So that's a brief look at the, that was the first page of looking at the Permanent Forum. So here's some of the aspects of the mandate of the forum. So the forum affirms that reparatory justice for African people and people of African descent remains a critical and urgent priority. The legacy of enslavement, colonialism, apartheid, and genocide within and among countries continues to manifest in systemic racism, underdevelopment, socio-economic disparities, and violations of human rights. It talks about reparations, but there's no mention of repatriation. Throughout the whole document, it doesn't recognize the fact that some Africans may want to return to the continent, even after hundreds of years being in the West in particular. They may want to return, but there's no real mention of that in the whole of this 10-year recognition. Reparations must be understood as a multidimensional process aimed at addressing these historical and contemporary injustices through measures including restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and guarantees of repetition and the restoration of dignity. I don't think I'm going to read all of them. Yeah, I'm not going to read all of them. There are a number of issues, but it doesn't talk about repatriation. This achievement reflects this is regarding the work of the Permanent Forum and the 10-year, this 10-year international decade, I should say. This achievement reflects the tireless advocacy of our region and strides made during the first decade, including global recognition of our 10-point plan for reparatory justice. That's the CARICOM Reparations Commission's 10-point plan, which includes repatriation as one of its elements, and the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum for People. This is Maya Motley. I think she's the current chair of the CARICOM group. And in terms of, well, they're saying this permanent body and the 10-year, this is 10 year of this international decade, the first 10 years of this international decade, I should say. It says more than 30 countries changed their laws and policies to tackle racial discrimination and address specific issues faced by people of African descent, which included the creation of this permanent forum. But I'm going to take a look at some of the countries that were involved in this. For example, Argentina created special measures for access to employment for people of African descent. Then Colombia, productive employment initiatives. Mexico created a work program for people of African descent. Costa Rica created a national policy for a society free from racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. Sweden in Europe created a national action plan against racism, similar forms of hostility and hate crimes. Switzerland created a database to address inequality. Peru and Portugal also created measures to ensure access to justice for victims of racial discrimination. And Germany, training of justice officials, that's people in the judiciary, were trained to eliminate institutional racism. And then lastly, Spain, some kind of policy to counter hate crimes. All of these things can be done, but it doesn't mean that you're going to eliminate racism merely through policy, because it would still be ingrained in the minds of the people. I think if you change an education system to inform people so that they have a broader perception of the world and realize the contributions of other people, like African people in the world, that can change their perception to a certain degree. But just changing laws, yes, you can change laws so that people treat others better, or are forced to treat others better. But if their perception of the people still remains the same, you're not going to get rid of that bias and prejudice. So, anyway, I'm going to take a look at some examples of racism that were mentioned by the United Nations. So in terms of reparatory justice, it's saying here, according to the United Nations, Africa and its diaspora have suffered from consequences of colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, and genocide. A critical objective is the need for reparatory justice for frameworks grounded in the international human rights law. As I've discussed in a program before, I think this issue of the Western concept of human rights, when you're framing racial justice in terms of individual rights, are you really tackling the issue in the right way, in an holistic way? You may be tackling it in a Western perception of rights as opposed to the broader, holistic, non-Western way, which is deals more with community and the collective rather than the individual. So you may promote human rights in a particular way which changes an African society or African community in terms of its behavior by making them become more individualistic or enforcing that idea of individualism into the minds of the people if you're focusing your policies around that. Anyway, the harshest contrast for Afro-descendant women and girls in the United States, where they are 3 times more likely to die during or shortly after childbirth than non-Afro-descendant women, while in Suriname, the rate is 2.5 times higher and 1.6 times higher in Brazil and Colombia. Slaney Palmer is an obstetrician from the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, working at a clinic in La Palma. So according to the UN, she also pays monthly visits to primarily indigenous women who won't otherwise have access to health services, including maternal and newborn baby emergencies. So she's saying basically that Afro-descendant patients say they were left waiting for longer, although the health professional thinks the waiting period is the same. But not with me. I'm a face they know. I'm an Afro just like them. Her testimony echoes the findings of a new report by the UN Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, which reveals that women and girls of African descent across the Americas face systemic racism and sexism in the health sector. Discrimination that is even proving deadly for all too many. So this goes on to talk about maternal deaths among people of African descent are often blamed on poor lifestyles, but in reality it's the racism within the system. Hereditary predispositions or failure to seek treatment in time, but the report refutes these mistaken beliefs, instead pointing to the patterns of abuse and neglect that start as early as medical education and stretch into policy making and health service delivery. So the whole health sector provides or produces some kind of bias and prejudice and racial prejudice in their provision of health services to the black communities in the Americas. Well, this one is focusing on the Americas, but this happens worldwide. Anyway, this is from the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism. It's talking about something relating to Black History Month. The fight against racism and racial discrimination is far from over. It's a fight that must not wane but must continue. Basically, it's saying that racism still exists in Europe and it needs to be tackled. So anyway, that's a look at this this organization, or this decade, or this project or program for the next 10 years. 10 years have gone, policies have been created. They say in 30 countries, I quoted 10 countries, but they say 10 countries have changed their policies in relation to racism in their societies and how they're going to tackle it. But it requires more than just changing policies. The whole perception of African people or black people around the world needs to change, and a proper understanding of history needs to be provided so that these societies, even though that won't fully change, once people have a prejudice, they'll have a prejudice. It doesn't matter what the contributions of another people. They'll still want to give the impression that they're better, as you know, the Europeans with their colonization program, which still exists to some extent today. And the fact that their colonization process is not over, because the changes that they made haven't been put back. Most people still wear European clothes. Most people around the world speak English. Their political systems are Western political systems. Many of them are now Christians. There are many things. The lifestyle that people lead now is basically a Western lifestyle. So Western colonization and neo-colonialism is still present, even though people don't recognize it. They think they're leading their lives. Many pay less attention to their own cultures and follow a Western lifestyle, even though they don't realize really that they're following a Western lifestyle. Anyway, that's enough of a look at this decade for people of African descent. Whether it will bring any real change, it's very doubtful, but it may help in some ways, but I think mainly it's up to African people, black people, to do something for themselves to allow a new perception of them to take place. Anyway, that's it for now.